And let me now introduce my panel, because this section is now called Innovative Practices in Adult Learning, a Global Perspective. So let me introduce our speakers. We have Andreas Schleicher, who is the Director for Education and Skills at the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and he's the Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Education Policy. We have Alison Crabb, the Head of Unit for Skills and Qualifications at the European Commission in the Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. We have Iva Batjes, the Director for the Centre for Integrated Post-School Education and Training at the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University in South Africa. And we have Cecilia Soriano, the Regional Policy and Advocacy Coordinator at the Asia South Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education. So truly a global panel to bring us forward on all of this. And thank you all for joining us this morning. Let me start by you, Andreas, because the OECD, does this collection of data across the world, and particularly the OECD countries. You have recently produced the Education at a Glance report. And of course, we've all lived through the last 18 months, which has seen real inequalities being exacerbated, both in resources and opportunities for learners and education systems. What have you seen in your Education at a Glance 2021 report?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. First of all, thanks for inviting me to this panel. When you think about the pandemic and education, you probably think first to school closures because they have been the most visible sign, and of course they dominate. But actually the impact on adult learning has been even stronger. We've seen a 17% decline in the intensity of adult learning, and it's not so hard to understand because a lot of that happens at the workplace, and it happens for people with applied skills. So it's not so difficult to understand, but it has not been very visible, but I think it's a clear sign. We've also seen that the crisis has limited job mobility and labor migration. It has made some sectors and some occupations non-viable. I think we've seen that clearly. Reduced income, increased uncertainty about lots of things. It has probably also underscored the value society's placed on vocational education and training. Now, they used to be the last resort in the pandemic. We've seen these occupations became the lifeline for our social and economic success. I think that's a big paradigm shift that I think we've seen, and quite different from the financial crisis. If you think back to 2008, the jobs that got hit first were the low-skilled jobs. That's where we saw a huge surge in unemployment. That was not so clear in this pandemic. Actually, both advanced professions and those with basic skills have been equally affected. Now, actually, some of the jobs that we needed most in this pandemic were ones that were more associated with non-traditional academic learning. So I think very different evolutions than what we saw in the financial crisis. The pandemic has also increased new demand for new sectors and occupations. It has given economies and opportunities to rebuild skills for the future. It has made it even more clear that the world of work and the world of learning are deeply integrated. And that's where adult learning really comes in. We used to learn to do the work, and now learning is the work. Now, if in the pandemic you could adjust, you could upgrade your skills, you could quickly move into new spaces, you were very successful. If you were locked into with one skill set and you couldn't sort of move into new areas, you were very badly left behind. And if, looking forward, a couple of points that I think, I take away from Education at a Glance and in our data is, first of all, when it comes to vocational education and training, more important than ever. But we probably need a lot more flexible provision on this, more training breaks, more modularization, provide more part-time, maybe even weekend online courses, things that, we had not thought about carefully enough before. Better support for employers with apprenticeships. Everybody promotes apprenticeships, but actually it requires a really good infrastructure. And I think in these years we have seen that infrastructure is often too weak to do this. But you also probably need to think a lot more about fast-track licensing, recognition of prior learning. Now, if you are short of medical staff, why don't you use workers from the airline industry that suffers in a pandemic now? And we're not very good at rerouting people quickly enough because it's so hard to recognize skills that you have attained in another profession. So developing better signals, becoming more nimble in how do we actually, modularize learning, adult learning, and then make it useful in other settings, I think is very, very important. Hospitality industry was badly struck, but we need people who in the care occupations now, and probably skill sets are not so different, but we think of them as distinct occupations, and I think better integration, I think, is very, very important. Looking, a little bit further, how do we reconcile skill demand and career aspirations? I think we've seen very clearly that there is a gap between what the occupations that young people aspire to. If you look to our survey data, 30-40% of 15-year-olds aspire to jobs that are at very high risk of automation. So education, schooling gives them an illusion of a world that probably will no longer exist when they graduate. How can we actually, I know we talk about adult learning, but how can we bring the adult work more closely into the world of initial learning? Giving young people with good career advice, career aspirations, bringing people from the world of work into learning to ensure that people make good choices and build strong foundations for adult learning. The one thing, and that's perhaps the most troubling indicator from education at a glance, is that people who have great skills, they continue to learn. But people who need that training most are the least likely to participate. So again, I think learning throughout life is likely to reinforce the many inequities in our societies, and therefore I think building those kinds of foundations, I think, is crucially important. Of course, when you think about adult learning, there's some really difficult questions. Now, everybody talks about the work, great places of work are great places of learning, but how do you actually share the funds between the individuals, the government, the employers? Now, how do you set the right incentives? Who sets the standards for that kind of learning? Now, in institutions, we have curricula, everything, but who actually regulates that kind of work? How do we recognize those skills? Now, you will not, transfer your skills if they are not recognized. And then, with a more kind of diffuse economy, new forms of work, and we probably end up with less taxes generated through the world of work. How do we actually build sort of the resource base for adult learning? In fact, when you look at spending patterns across countries, the share of resources that really are devoted to learning beyond institutions is tiny. And it's actually often in a very patchy, unregulated framework. I think those are really tough questions that we need to ask ourselves after this pandemic. I do think the pandemic provides an opportunity, has dramatically exposed the weaknesses in our adult learning systems. And I'm not just talking about the training opportunities. I'm talking about, what are the incentives, the motivations for people to go there? How do we recognize this? If you look at that entire ecosystem, it's been pretty badly exposed, and I think we now have an opportunity to rebuild that.
Thank you. You've given us a huge amount of information that we can pick up on and talk about with other members of the panel. And I think one thing that I would strongly agree with you is that the pandemic revealed some very sharp lessons that we all need to learn and to adjust to, and many of them you've picked up on, the lack of resources in the non-institutional space, the need to understand how to be more nimble. And we, as you said, we've come out of the pandemic with huge skills shortages. Europe is facing an enormous lack of HGV drivers. And this is addressing our supply chains and our logistics. So sometimes it's really quite simple and clear to see where the skill gaps, and other times it's more complicated. Let me now bring in Alison Crabb from the European Commission, because you at the Commission, you have this oversight of both where we're going in terms of the demographic transition. You can see the green transition and the labour market transition all intersecting, and that's clearly an area where education and skills plays a key role. And Andreas told us just where our gaps are. There's insufficient resources. A lot of work needs to be done on incentives and standards, recognition of skills, being more nimble. So let me get a sense for you. How important is this issue for the European Commission, and where does learning and skills fit within the big vision of where Europe should be in the next 10 years?
Thanks, Tamsin. Good morning, everyone. Very nice to be online with the EPALE community this morning, and thanks for the invitation to the panel. I mean, I think that the first thing to say, and I'm sure it is the theme of this conference, really is that COVID has been an accelerator of a lot of these trends, and I think Andreas summed that up very well. There's many issues that they're not new to us in the adult learning community, but in the last 18 months there has been a very sharp spotlight on some of these issues, and really the digital and green transitions, which we've been talking about for a while. It feels as if we've gone into top gear when it comes to the need to respond to that and to master that. Looking through now the lens of the work that the Commission is doing, I think I would put this under the motto really of the just transition. And again, it's perfect timing to put a focus in the EPALE Community Conference on this issue of how to make sure that the twin transitions, the digital and green transitions, and the recovery from COVID are fair, are socially inclusive, and are just. And the role of skills in that, of course, is really a fascinating one. I would also say that it has really shot adult learning and adult skills development up the policy agenda. And we see this, if we take a bit of a step back and we look at the discussions in the spring at heads of state level, the so-called social summit, which is EU heads of state and government, the highest political level, who are talking about the way forward on the social and employment front. And one of the three targets that they have actually agreed on is all about adult skills development. So setting the target that 60% of working age adults by the year 2030 should be engaging in learning every year. Now, everyone has their own opinion on whether this target is ambitious enough. Is it high? Is it low? 60%? One could speculate that, in fact, everyone on the labour market today is going to need to address our skills development. Demographics, of course, is not on our side. Most of us on the labour market today will still be there in 20 years' time. So we're talking about today's workforce, people who are already in place in the labour market. But to say that I think we should take heart very much from the level of political ambition setting the 60% target, which is a huge leap forward from today's situation across Europe. It's under 40% of adults engaging in learning, and with huge varieties, of course, across the Union, and with a tremendous degree of inequity. And Andreas pointed to that. Of course, we know that those who benefit the most are permanent employees with a close link to their employer, typically higher skilled and full-time contracts. And ironically, it's those in sectors at the higher risk of automation, probably with lower skill sets and qualifications, who are harder to engage in learning. So perhaps, as a first kind of thought to take with us into this discussion, I would take heart from that fact that, as I say, at the highest political level in EU policymaking, that target has been set. Sophia pointed to some of the funding firepower that accompanies this. What is unprecedented at the moment, of course, in terms of EU financial support, is the so-called Recovery and Resilience Facility, bit of an off-putting name, but for a very significant amount of money, 720 billion euro of loans and grants for member states to programme. And one of the tracks which the Commission has been strongly encouraging them to programme those funds on is adult upskilling and reskilling. So we have an opportunity, as well as the challenges that we have seen coming through the pandemic. So perhaps we will come back, I hope, later in the panel to talk a bit about some of the solutions. But maybe that as an opening thought, let's take heart from the impetus that is there from the twin transitions, from the need to recover from the pandemic, looking at financial measures, and also all the rest, which money alone cannot solve, the slow and steady process of policy cooperation and policy reform to build strong adult skills systems.
Thank you, Alison. And this panel is designed to look at the global perspective. So I'm delighted to bring in Iva from South Africa now. Of course, you have a very different demographic transition in Africa from the one we have in Europe. You have a very young population, but perhaps some of the same challenges about how to match the offer of education to those who most need it. So, what are the current priorities in Africa and in South Africa in the area of adult education? Is it mostly aimed at trying to provide economic opportunity? How about the role of education transforming people's life chances?
Well, Tamsin, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. And what I want to do is I want to share with you some of the innovations that are currently evident and emerging on the African continent. Of course, I can speak in much more detail about what is happening in South Africa, but based on my conversations with colleagues across the continent, we thought that it might be useful to share with you and to shed light on what I would call the pluriverse of possibility of innovative and transformative adult education practices that are prevalent on the continent, and most of it is non-formal. It's overwhelmingly non-formal in nature. And of course, as you can imagine, it is very difficult and it's challenging to talk about the scope, breadth, and depth of innovation in this event, given the vast number of examples and experiences across the continent. So therefore, I just want to bring into the conversation a few of these transformative practices that form part of this pluriverse of building hope and possibility on the continent. So it is very clear that Africa remains pregnant with innovative initiatives that focus on the ways in which adult education can contribute to socioeconomic transformation, especially of communities and to the larger society. And one of the weaknesses, of course, for us is that because of the non-formal nature of adult education, largely on the continent, we lack detailed documentation and research that can tell us the stories of these innovations in the amount of detail that I think is important. And today, what we see, though, is that this pluriverse includes many philosophical orientations and methodological approaches in which government, civil society, community-based organizations, grassroots formations are involved in socioeconomic development of communities. And in some cases, of course, we have governments that would partner with civil society organizations, both local and international, to conceptualize, implement projects and programs. In other cases, civil society organizations combine their efforts with communities to use adult education as a vehicle to address a variety of community-related issues. However, more and more, we see the agency within communities themselves and how community agency and resilience emerge as ways to address community issues by themselves, almost autonomously. So you have this growth of autonomous resilience within communities to speak to the issues that communities are facing and how adult education then comes into play to address these myriad of issues in communities. So what is the innovation here? The big innovation in many of the countries is a departure from very traditional functional literacy approaches. So there's such a focus on the 3 R's, for example. So what you are beginning to see is a recognition of the multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary nature of adult education and how literacy, or the 3 R's, are integrated in these forms of programs. So what we are seeing is the emergence of integrated programs that countries are beginning to implement. Of course, very difficult circumstances. The triad of poverty, unemployment, and inequality is a big issue. And as you know, it is often place, education is often seen as a kind of a panacea to address this particular issue. So let me just share with you 3 examples here. And the 3 examples relate to what has emerged during COVID, and which is related in a large way to the ecological crisis that we are experiencing in the continent. As you know, or you may know, that the eastern part of Africa is currently in a serious drought. So countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia are deeply affected by this. So the issue of food and hunger has been propelled into, has been given significant prominence within many of these countries. So what you see is the kind of a gathering around building community food systems to make communities more food secure. And this is where the adult education work now kicks in. So, for example, just last year in Tunisia, the DVV International, working and building on the work of the Food and Agriculture Organization, initiated a program which they call CEP Alpha, which translates into English as Farmer Field Schools and Literacy Projects, and where the focus is on rural women, where literacy levels are quite high. So what DVV International with these communities have started doing is to start implementing a variety of food production activities such as poultry, beekeeping, exploiting the value of aromatic plants, producing sun-dried tomatoes, and so on. And so what is happening in these communities is that the adult literacy is firmly integrated into the larger scheme of food security, food sovereignty, and so on. And they have started to look at solidaristic forms of cooperation, setting up small businesses to generate livelihoods for communities. A similar example has been initiated in Uganda through their integrated community literacy and wealth creation project, which is a partnership between the Ministry of Labour, Gender and Social Development and DVB again. And this is an interesting case because the adult education is not based in a Department of Education. It is with Labour, Gender, Social Development, which is a very interesting configuration. But what has happened here, very similar to what is playing out in Tunisia, is this focus on integrating food production with the establishment of village savings and loans associations. So they're combining food production with small businesses, development of cooperatives and small businesses. Similarly, Mali has similar projects underway, of course, different set of dynamics given the context and so on. And lastly, because I think my time is running out, I want to highlight the importance of the innovative practices that involve many of the social movements, multi-transdisciplinary formations and autonomous groupings across the continent. And some of these formations, for example, such as La Via Campesina in southern and eastern Africa, the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, eco-villages that are being established. So there's just this enormous explosion of autonomous groupings dealing with this issue of food, because suddenly community education is seen as very important in addressing the food-related issue. So just in summary, what I want to highlight for this conversation is that we recognize this pluriverse of possibility in Africa that shifts the focus of adult education away from traditional approaches, becoming more multidisciplinary in nature, in very difficult circumstances, and during a time of great transformation driven by the ecological crisis and the so-called industrial revolution. So I think what is important for us now is to understand much better how these innovations actually work. What can we learn from them, and how can we use them to build more praxis of transformation within this continent? So let me end there.
Thank you very much, Iva. Really interesting to hear some of these examples of how the shift in focus in the adult learning sector is starting to help communities address real life challenges that they're dealing with. And as you've highlighted, agriculture, the food shortages and food autonomy is a core area where you can see bringing in skills makes a big difference to people. Let me now bring in our last speaker, because each speaker before has talked about inequalities and how much that's been exacerbated by the pandemic. So can I ask you, Celia, to come in and tell us what is the role of civil society, of NGOs in reducing the disparities in adult education and raising awareness on the non-formal education? Andreas mentioned that this is a growing area. Alison and Iva have all talked about the shift away from institutions and needing to pick up on this other area and look at skills recognition. So what do you think is the contribution that can be made by civil society?
Thanks, Tamsin, and greetings from the Philippines. I'm happy to be with the EPALE community today. So this is a very important discussion on non-formal education, and in Asia Pacific, this is really one of the priority agenda that we have in ASBE. It is because in Asia Pacific, we have a glaring disparity in education. So just to share with you that in our region is home to 50% of the world's out-of-school population, and most of them are in secondary education. And also 61% of the illiterate adults worldwide is in our region also. So this is really a massive challenge that we face. And civil society organizations working with marginalized communities have been at the forefront of advocating for the right to education of children, as well as the right to education of youth and adults. But at the same time, we also demonstrate effective programs for children, youth, and adults who have been pushed out of the education system or have never been in the education system. So as an example, let me just share what ASBE has been doing. And one is the Youth-Led Action Research, which started as a collective education and advocacy program working with marginalized sectors, working with young people from diverse marginalized backgrounds. So for the past 5 years, we have been building the capacities for research and advocacy of young people, from the girls and young people in rural communities in India, Indonesia, Nepal, and Mongolia. We have also been working with young people in urban settlements and fishing communities in the Philippines, Timor-Leste, Sri Lanka, as well as with hearing impaired youth in Vietnam. And how we do it, since ASBE is a network, so we work with our members. We conduct regional trainings on participatory action research, which was really very prominent in the 90s, 80s. But what we did was to adapt these principles in the current situation and with young people. We designed collective research and advocacy trainings together with young people. And now we have shifted to online trainings on participatory action research. But this is also good because there are platforms that have interpretation, function, so that allows us to have several languages so that young people from marginalized communities can participate. Our members in the country, they provide trainings, follow-up trainings, and they provide mentoring to these young people from marginalized communities, not only in doing research and advocacy, but more importantly, how they can negotiate with their own families. Because for the girls, for example, in India, even to go out of their house is a big, challenge for them, because the families, they don't allow them to go out of the house. And also to negotiate with the communities and local governments. So let me just give you a story. In Nepal, in an indigenous community, the girls, they did the research on the impact of alcoholism and early marriage on education access, on their own education access. But these girls were chased out by their neighbors themselves, because the elderly people were saying, why are you asking these questions? You know, these are not proper questions for you to ask, you know. But because the young people, they know, you know, why they're doing it, and they have sustained their confidence, they persevered. And then they said that, well, research is our right, asking questions is our right, and we are looking for recommendations for education so that this can be accessible to us. So these are, you know, but it is still a challenge. So the youth mentors were always there having meetings with them. So this is the kind of education that we have been doing at the community level. And the youth-led action research, we found out, is very important during the pandemic, especially when we talk about social cohesion, when we talk about well-being of young people. At the onset of COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, as early in April, these same young people, they recruited other volunteers, and they went out of their houses to interview their peers on how they are feeling. You know, how are you? How have you been affected by the pandemic? Do you think you're going back to school? How are you going to cope with online when you don't have even the, you know, gadgets? And what are your recommendations to government? So these were the kind of questions that they asked. And ASBE provided, you know, the training and support to do this youth-led action research together with, you know, DVV International and the Swiss Development Cooperation. And we did this in 9 countries across Asia Pacific. And we are proud to say that the young people were really very courageous, and they managed to put together their analysis, and they did local level advocacy, because it's not possible to do national level. But they work with national organizations to, you know, promote and disseminate their findings. So if you visit the ASBE website, you will see the regional report on youth-led action research on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on marginalized youth and education and well-being. So please visit our website. Now for this year, we are going to do another youth-led action research, and this is on mental health and well-being of young people by popular demand of young people themselves. So as a conclusion, we think that this is an example of a community education. We can say it's non-formal education, but we know that the support of the local government is very important. And we also have been, we have put together our lessons from youth-led action research because we want the governments to adopt it and scale up youth-led action research as a strategy for SDG 4.7, or Global Citizenship Education Beyond Schools. So if you would like to look at our YAR e-manual, you can download it. You can look at the YAR e-manual in the ASBE website, and you can view it on your mobile, because we use parallax so that you can scroll up and down the manual. And we hope that governments will adopt this as a strategy. Local governments have already, we have the attention of local governments, but we hope the ministries of education would give more attention to this. So thank you so much. This is an experience from Asia Pacific.
Thank you very much, and really interesting, particularly I think as it's yet another example after Iva of how education is a lever for social change, for changing people's self-esteem, their possibility to have agency in their own communities. I think these are wonderful examples of everything we've talked about, the benefits of education and adult education. I think this was great. I know we've had some really interesting comments in the online community, and some of them have picked up on the mental health aspect that Celia has spoken so clearly about. I'm going to bring in our online moderator, Sarah, now to share some of the ideas and questions that our audience have for our panel. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. I was noticing that exactly while Cecilia was speaking, there was this comment which is really into the same mood. Which says efforts should be made to encourage adult learning on an ongoing basis, as this provides both mental health, sustainability, and new skills and experiences. So new knowledge is very useful in this pandemic period because it helps to filter the information received and helps to find a way out of situations that have to be overcome, both at work and in personal life. So mixing work and life skills. And there is also another general comment, let's say, about the spreading the knowledge, so the outreach of adult education, which says that I think one of the main problems with the commitment not to leave anyone behind is that people with lower skills and poorly educated often do not know the existence of adult education. They do not come in contact with the possibilities that are offered. So these are the more general questions that and the issues that arose in the commentary. And then we have a specific question addressed to Mr. Schleicher. I don't know if you want, Tamsin, do you want me to say it now? Yeah, perfect. It's about the recognition of non-formal learning outcomes. That is to say that non-traditional academic learning is conquering more and more space, as Mr. Schleicher said. The labor market is constantly changing shape, but are employers ready to recognize such learning activities?
Thank you, Sarah. That's great. So we've had some comments and some questions. Andreas, if I could perhaps invite you to respond to the question that was specific to you, to say that we're seeing a sort of growth in the non-formal area of skills and adult learning, and how ready are the labour market employers to accept and recognise the skills that are gained in this way. You yourself said that this is an increasing trend, but are employers set up for this? You're on mute.
Sorry, I don't think it's so much an issue whether employers are ready for it. It is the question more: do we have the right signals for employers to recognize the skills that people have? And I think this is where systems need to work on. You can see, for example, in the tech sector, this is working really well. You have a lot of micro-credentialing systems that are actually accepted by employers. And suddenly, employers care more about those signals than about formal degrees and qualifications. So actually, I think there's good evidence that actually employers are really, looking for ways that actually signal skills, and they are, often tired of this kind of lumpy degrees and qualifications. And what, I hope we are going to see actually in the future is more often an unbundling of educational content, delivery and accreditation. We have, if we're honest, a very monopolistic sector in education generally and in adult learning also. And I think if technology could help us actually to give people more ownership over what they learn, how they learn, when they learn, and where they learn. And I think when that happens, and when we combine that with good kind of credentialing systems that allow people to accumulate smaller bits of learning, we are going to see, I think, on the employer side, I think, good acceptance. I have no doubts about this. We lack currently a currency. Skills are, like a currency, and we do not have that kind of philosophy on this. And that brings also, you mentioned this, gap between work and life skills. In fact, I think that will, if we are actually doing well on this, that will disappear. At the moment, this idea that you have job-related training and other non-formal learning, the question today is not just do you improve in your current job, but are you ready for your next job? And is your employer actually recognizing those additional skills? And I think the moment we have those right signals, I think we're going to see. And for me, by the way, this is a big role where government can make a difference. I think on the provision of training, maybe, but I think a lot of learning will take place in the enterprises and in non-formal settings. But on the regulatory framework to actually ensure that we can see this, the skills of people and make sure that they translate into better jobs and better lives, I do believe there's a big role that actually public policy could play to make this work better than now.
Thank you. Alison, I saw you nodding a lot when Andreas was speaking. The minute we start talking about the regulatory framework, the spotlight always comes to the European Commission. But let me ask you to pick up on some of this. And particularly, I thought what was quite interesting is this shift away from lumpy degrees and a sort of single structure that develops the content, delivers it, and moving away from institutions and perhaps more to individuals having more control about what they learn. How's the thinking evolving inside the European Commission?
Yeah, it's such an interesting debate right now, and those of you who are EU watchers will perhaps have been engaged in some consultations over the summer that we've been running on a proposal for the so-called individual learning account. So let's say a fresh approach to trying to tackle this long-standing issue of really opening up lifelong learning pathways. What more can we do? What different can we do to try to get more adults actually participating in learning? So from the Commission side then, looking into a model in which all working age adults, probably a universal entitlement, would be entitled to a certain amount of money to invest in ongoing training and learning activities. So in shorthand, one can call this, putting the individual adult in the driving seat of their learning. Now, that sounds a very simple thing to do. All of us online right now know it's very far from simple, because it is taking place in a landscape that we've been talking about this morning, which has to include guidance opportunities, validation opportunities, a shared understanding of the value of the skills that these adults are bringing with them and acquiring. So it's a proposal in the pipeline at the moment. We hope to be discussing it with member states next year, but looking through this lens of how can we enable an individual adult learner to have a bit more agency over their own training pathway. And maybe just a word also on micro credentials. So Andreas mentioned the qualifications and credentials landscape. Part of actually making this learning pathway really accessible and meaningful for adults is bringing a shared trust and understanding to these little bits of learning which are taking place throughout our careers, and whether that's a formal training course, maybe in a workplace, or whether it's skills that you've acquired on the job and that you're looking to have validated, or we're using the word recognised this morning. These micro credentials, ways of capturing those outcomes in a way which we can trust and understand as employers and learning organisations, is so important. So Commission also coming forward by the end of this year with a proposal for a European approach to that, to try to bring a bit of trust and transparency and shared understanding to this very fluid world of micro credentials.
Thank you, Alison. Ivy, if I could bring you in now, picking up on the African continent now, because we've heard the examples of the moving away from institutions, more opportunities for individuals, but a lot of that rests on some kind of institutional infrastructure and a recognition between different governments on, this credential works there. Ivy, you shared specific examples from different African countries, but already in Africa we have large numbers of people on the move as a result of conflict, as food shortages and climate. So to what extent is this happening at a continent level, this investment in skills recognition and competencies, etc.?
Yeah, Tamsin, this is not really much of a discourse in most of the African countries. I think South Africa is probably one of the countries where this conversation is held more often. It is part of the architecture of the South African adult and technical vocational education system. So maybe I can say something about that. I think the big issue here is South Africa post-apartheid in the year 2000 launched a significant national skills development strategy. And I would argue that we have such an enormous growth in skills since the launch of that national skills development strategy that focused on qualifications, so people could go through programs, acquire bits and pieces of qualifications, and end up graduating with those qualifications. The big problem in South Africa is the high levels of unemployment. So we're sitting with an unemployment rate of 34%, which is the highest apparently in the world, and we have 70% of our youth outside who are unemployed. They are not in the formal labor market. So we have an estimated 18 million South Africans who are outside of the wage labor relations, means they don't have jobs in the formal labor market. But at the same time, you see a 50% unemployment rate amongst engineering graduates from our technical vocational education colleges in the country. We have a very, very poor graduation rate amongst adults who are in our community education and training centers, and a significant dropout rate of more than 50%. So we are sitting with a significant difficulty to get people into forms of work. Our university graduates are experiencing increasing unemployment. So there is a big debate here, and also quite a lot of blaming that's going on. So, for example, business and industry would say that, you know, students don't have the right skills, they need this kind of skill and that kind of skill. So a lot of that is currently taking place in the South African context, and we've got a lot of thinking to do about how we get people into forms of work. So the idea of socially useful work is now also a topic that is being discussed to get people involved in work rather than to look at the labor market only. And this is the case, this is where the idea of building educational programs to develop solidaristic forms of cooperation, cooperatives are becoming important, because there's lots of work to do. Our public infrastructure is falling apart, and so you need to get these young people and adults involved in that kind of work. So we are sitting in an unemployment crisis at the moment.
Thank you, Ivor, for that. And as you say, there's lots to be done, but that does require some rethinking and reapproaching. So let me, we're coming towards the end of our time, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists to share. If I had a rusty lamp and I could rub it, and I could offer, if I was a genie and I could offer you some wishes, what would you, and I'll start with you, Cecilia, what would be your wish for Aladdin's lamp looking at the future of adult education? Cecilia.
Well, first of all, when I say we, in ASBE, we would like to see governments investing more in adult education, because we see in Asia Pacific, the countries are only spending 1% of their national education budget to adult learning and education. And we also see that education systems have to be strengthened, not only focusing on formal, but strengthening non-formal and now informal education. Our second wish is that education systems should rethink education. And we have been talking about this already. Apart from skills development, let's look at social cohesion, which is now very important. And in our region, climate change is really a major issue, and how to prepare our adults, youth and adults, to be more, to have an agency to address these challenges. So that's all my two.
Two is great. Investment and rethinking education. I think that's a good start. We'll collect as many wishes as we can. I can't promise a genie will deliver them, but let's see what we can do. Alison, can I come to you next? What would be your wishes for the genie of Aladdin's lamp for adult education?
Well, I mean, I think I would ask the genie really to wave a magic wand and create genuinely a culture of adult skills development in which it is the norm for adults, regardless of initial education and training level, regardless of their labour market status, to engage in learning. And that culture, of course, and that's what we're here to debate in this conference, is driven by a whole bunch of reforms on access to guidance, support, financial, non-financial. But I think I would sum it up that way. Looking to the future, I would love to see us a few years down the road in which it is absolutely normal for adults to engage in skills development throughout life.
Thank you. Ivor, do you have a wish for Aladdin's lamp?
I'll share one wish with you. I think what I would love to see in a number of our African countries is just a network of community learning spaces that are well supported by government, and where adults are free to learn and to build an educational program that recognizes the importance of eco-pedagogy given the ecological crisis that we are currently facing.
Thank you, Iva. And Andreas, I'm going to come to you because if Aladdin's Genie can deliver us, we're going to have more investment. We're going to have a culture where it's normal for adults to be acquiring and adapting their skills. We'll have a rethink of the education and more connected into social cohesion, and we'll have interconnected community learning spaces with a strong link into some of the sustainability and the green skills that we need to adapt for life on this planet. So it's sounding good already. What else would you like to add?
Yeah, actually, I share very much sort of Alison's perspective on this. And I would, this aspect of creating a culture where learning and working are really very well integrated. And I think it's also about developing more of a growth mindset among people. This idea that you can grow beyond your limits. And that is sort of something that is more native to us. At the moment, I think we're still putting people into boxes, and we have a lot of the power of adult learning is with the providers, and actually we need greater ownership on the part of individuals and learners too. And if you ask me, the specific wish, I do believe it comes back to, I think the easiest part. The money part is hard to change, but I think the easy part is really the recognition of learning, just to make sure that there are more ways for people's skills to shine, so that we can actually, see the skills that people actually have, not just the degrees that they earn. And I think if we do see them, we're going to use them and transform them, better jobs and better lives.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, if I genuinely had the power of Aladdin's lamp, I would like to grant you all of those wishes, because I think they would really, move us to a society and a world that is better and worth living in. So I'd like to say a warm thank you to Andreas, to Alison, to Iva, and to Cecilia for sharing your visions, to Sarah for bringing in some of the questions and comments from the audience, which was really helpful in our debate. So I'm closing this panel now.